The courtroom was already quiet when Connor Carrington asked the judge to finalize the divorce. He stood tall beside his attorney, confident, composed like a man closing a business deal, rather than ending 11 years of marriage. A few rows behind him, Madeline Pierce watched with a small, satisfied smile. Certain the future had already chosen her. Across the room, Isla Carrington said nothing. She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply folded her hands and waited. Then the judge opened a newly submitted folder. The pages rustled once. "Before this court proceeds, Mr. Carrington," the judge said calmly, adjusting his glasses, "we need to review these financial disclosures." For the first time that morning, Connor Carrington stopped smiling. Some truths, after all, arrive quietly right before the verdict. If you believe that truth has a way of finding its moment, stay with this story. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you appreciate stories about quiet strength, patience, and justice, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Now let's go back to where this story really began. Long before the courtroom, before the lawyers and the quiet rustle of evidence folders, there had been a marriage most people admired. Isla Carrington and Connor Carrington had been together for 11 years, and to anyone who saw them from the outside, their life appeared steady, successful, and uncomplicated. They lived in a restored brownstone in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, a house with tall windows and warm wooden floors that caught the afternoon light. The kind of house people slowed down to look at when they walked past. Connor liked that house because it reflected success. Isla liked it because it was quiet. Connor Carrington was the kind of man who moved easily through crowded rooms. At 39, he had already built a reputation inside Redwood Urban Development, a fast-growing real estate firm known for turning neglected city blocks into luxury apartment complexes. He was the company's director of project development, a position that required charm as much as strategy. Investors trusted him. Colleagues listened when he spoke. And when Connor shook someone's hand, he looked directly into their eyes in a way that made people believe he meant exactly what he said. It was a talent that had helped him rise quickly. Isla Carrington was different. She worked across the city at an accounting firm that specialized in financial audits for mid-sized corporations. Her days were spent studying spreadsheets, verifying statements, and tracing the small numerical inconsistencies that others overlooked. Numbers had always made more sense to her than conversations. She didn't speak often in meetings, but when she did, people listened. Not because she raised her voice, but because she rarely said anything unless she was certain. If Connor thrived in the spotlight, Isla existed comfortably just outside it. They had met 13 years earlier at a charity fundraiser hosted by a mutual friend. Connor had been lively, confident, already moving through the room like a man who expected the world to open doors for him. Isla had been standing near a window, studying the skyline more than the people. Connor noticed her because she didn't seem interested in being noticed. He introduced himself. She listened. That was how it started. Over time, their differences seemed to complement each other. Connor's energy filled spaces Isla preferred to avoid. Isla's calm steadiness anchored Connor during the rare moments when business deals became unpredictable. Friends described them as balanced. Connor told people he admired Isla's intelligence. Isla told people Connor had ambition. For many years, both statements were true. The first signs of change were so small they barely registered. Connor began traveling more frequently for work. At first, it was understandable. Redwood Urban Development had begun expanding into other cities: Boston, Denver, sometimes Seattle. Connor's job required site visits, investor meetings, late dinners with potential partners. Isla didn't question it. She understood how companies grew. But as the months passed, the travel became more frequent. Sometimes Connor left on Thursday mornings and didn't return until late Sunday evening. His suitcase stayed half-packed in their bedroom closet, ready for the next trip. He said the company was entering a competitive phase. Isla believed him, at least in the beginning. The second change came with Connor's phone. Connor had never been careless with his devices, but he had never been secretive either. For years, his phone had rested casually on the kitchen counter or the coffee table without much thought. Now it stayed with him. If he stepped outside to take a call, he took the phone. If a message appeared while they were watching television, the screen tilted slightly away before he read it. One evening, Isla noticed he had added a new passcode. She didn't ask about it. She simply noticed. Connor's behavior didn't become cruel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse Isla of anything. Instead, something quieter happened. He became distant. Conversations grew shorter. Dinner together became less frequent. Sometimes Connor arrived home late with the familiar explanation that investors wanted to meet after hours. Other nights, he claimed to be too tired and went straight upstairs. Isla did not argue. Confrontation had never been her instinct. But she observed. Observation, after all, was part of her profession. At first, she simply paid attention. She noticed how Connor's travel stories became vague. He mentioned cities without describing meetings. He referred to people whose names he never repeated. The details were missing. Then, one evening, while reviewing their monthly bank statements, Isla saw something that didn't quite fit. The Carringtons shared several financial accounts, joint checking joint savings, and a credit card used primarily for household expenses. Isla handled most of the routine financial organization simply because she was better at it. That night, she sat at the dining table with her laptop open, reviewing transactions the way she always did at the end of the month. Groceries, utility payments, mortgage. Everything looked ordinary until she reached a charge from a restaurant she recognized. Alinea, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago. The bill was just over $600. Isla paused. Connor occasionally met investors for dinner, and expensive restaurants were common in those situations. Normally, he mentioned those meetings afterward, sometimes even laughing about how complicated the tasting menus had been. But Isla couldn't remember Connor mentioning Alinea. She read the date again. 2 weeks earlier, Connor had told her that night he was attending a planning meeting at the Redwood office. Isla closed the bank statement and opened the company website on her laptop. Redwood Urban Development published internal project updates, regularly including scheduled planning sessions for major developments. She scrolled through the archived announcements. There had been no meeting that night. Isla sat still for a long moment. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Upstairs, Connor was already asleep. The discovery did not create immediate anger. It created a question. In her profession, questions were the beginning of everything. Instead of waking Connor or confronting him the next morning, Isla did something much simpler. She began writing things down. Inside the drawer of her desk sat a small black notebook she had once used for work notes during long audit meetings. The pages were mostly empty. She opened it and wrote a date at the top of the page. Underneath, she wrote Alinea, $612.45, Connor said office meeting. Then she closed the notebook. At the time, it didn't feel like the beginning of an investigation. It felt like a detail worth remembering. Over the following weeks, Isla continued her routine. She went to work each morning. She prepared dinner when Connor was home. They spoke politely about ordinary things, weather, construction delays on the nearby street, occasional updates about Connor's projects. To anyone watching them at a distance, nothing appeared wrong. But Isla's notebook slowly filled with small observations. Dates of business trips, restaurant charges, hotel confirmations attached to credit card statements. Patterns began to appear. Not dramatic patterns, subtle ones. Certain cities appeared more frequently than others. Certain dates repeated every few weeks. And occasionally a name appeared in Connor's forwarded work emails that Isla recognized from earlier financial reports. Madeline Pierce, Director of Marketing. The name meant nothing at first, just another colleague. Still, Isla wrote it down, not because she believed anything yet, but because numbers and names had a way of revealing their meaning later. And Isla Carrington had always believed in patience. Some truths only appear when you give them time. By the end of that first month, Isla's notebook contained only a handful of entries. Nothing anyone could call proof, but enough to make her pay attention. And attention once sharpened rarely fades. The first discrepancy did not feel dramatic. It did not arrive with an argument or a confrontation or even a raised voice. It arrived quietly, like most things that later become impossible to ignore. 2 weeks after Isla had written down the Alinea charge in her notebook, she was once again sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. Financial statements were familiar terrain for her. She had reviewed thousands of them during her years working in corporate audits. Most people assumed numbers were neutral, lifeless rows on a screen. But Isla knew better. Numbers told stories. You only had to read them carefully. Connor's credit card statement had just been posted for the month. Isla opened the file and began scanning the transactions with the same patient attention she used at work. Gas stations, office supply purchases, airline tickets, nothing unusual. Then another restaurant appeared. This time, the charge was from a place in downtown Chicago called Sienna Room, an upscale restaurant known mostly among business professionals who preferred private dining rooms for discreet meetings. The bill was $487. The date caught her attention. That was the same evening Connor had told her he was flying to Boston for a 2-day site inspection. Isla sat back slightly in her chair. The Boston trip had been mentioned casually during breakfast that morning. Connor had said the flight left in the afternoon. He even complained about the inconvenience of traveling midweek. She remembered because he had left his coffee half-finished on the kitchen counter before rushing out. But the Sienna Room charge had been recorded at 8:43 p.m. in Chicago, not Boston. Isla did not jump to conclusions. Instead, she opened another tab on her laptop and logged into their airline rewards account. Connor frequently used the shared account to book work flights because it allowed them to accumulate travel points. She searched the date. There was no flight, no boarding pass, no reservation under Connor's name. The Boston trip had never existed. Isla remained still for a long moment. Outside the window, traffic moved slowly along the street. Headlights slid across the living room walls like pale reflections of passing lives. She could hear Connor upstairs speaking on the phone. His voice carried faintly through the ceiling, calm, confident, professional. If someone had asked Isla at that moment what she felt, she might not have been able to answer immediately. It wasn't shock, it wasn't anger, it was something quieter, recognition. Because once a pattern begins to form, the mind starts searching backward for earlier signs. Isla reopened the notebook in her desk drawer. She added another line. Sienna Room, $487, same night as Boston trip. Then she closed the notebook again. Connor came downstairs a few minutes later, still holding his phone. He walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, unaware that Isla had been reviewing the bank statements only moments earlier. "You're still working?" he asked casually. Isla nodded. "Just finishing a few reports." Connor leaned against the counter, scrolling through something on his phone. The screen's light reflected briefly in his eyes. "Work emails, perhaps, or something else. Next week might get busy again," he said after a moment. "We're negotiating a land purchase in Denver. I might need to travel." Isla looked up at him. "Denver, yeah," Connor replied. "Probably just a couple days." Isla studied his expression the way she might study a financial document, without judgment, but with attention to detail. Connor's tone sounded natural, comfortable, practiced. She realized then that Connor believed his explanations were working. That belief, more than anything else, told her how long this had probably been happening. "Let me know the dates," Isla said quietly. Connor nodded. "Of course." He finished his water, set the glass in the sink, and headed upstairs. Isla listened to his footsteps fade. Only then did she reopen the credit card statement. She examined the Sienna room charge again. Restaurants like that didn't operate like ordinary diners. They often required reservations, sometimes even deposits for private dining areas, which meant someone had planned that dinner in advance. Someone who expected privacy. Isla opened her laptop's email search bar. Connor occasionally used the home laptop when his work computer needed updates. His email account had been logged in before. She typed a simple search term, Sienna. The system processed for a moment. Then 2 archived messages appeared. Both had been sent from Connor's work email account. Both were confirmations. One for a reservation, one for a follow-up message thanking the restaurant for accommodating a special evening. Isla read the reservation details carefully. 2 guests, private table, 8:30 p.m. At the bottom of the confirmation email was a short note Connor had written to the restaurant manager, celebrating something important. Isla stared at that sentence longer than she expected, celebrating what the answer didn't appear in the email. But another name appeared in the message thread. The confirmation had been forwarded earlier that afternoon to someone else. Madeline Pierce. Isla's eyes rested on the name. Director of Marketing, Redwood Urban Development. She had seen the name once before in Connor's forwarded project emails. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it meant slightly more. Not proof, not yet. Just a connection. Isla leaned back in her chair. She didn't feel the urge to storm upstairs or demand explanations. That reaction belonged to people who needed immediate answers. Isla preferred complete ones. Instead, she downloaded the email thread. Then she saved a copy to a folder on her laptop labeled simply Archive. After that, she opened a new document. On the top line, she typed Madeline Pierce possible connection. Underneath, she added the dates of both restaurant charges. The pattern still wasn't large enough to reveal the full picture. But patterns rarely begin large. They begin with fragments. And Isla Carrington had spent most of her professional life assembling fragments until the truth finally appeared. Later that evening, Connor returned downstairs wearing comfortable clothes and carrying 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to Isla. "Thought you might need a break," he said with a small smile. Isla accepted the glass. "Thank you." They sat together on the couch for a while, watching a television show neither of them followed very closely. Connor seemed relaxed, at ease. He laughed at a scene halfway through the episode, the kind of spontaneous laugh people produce when they feel completely safe. Isla noticed the sound. She also noticed something else. Connor checked his phone 3 times in 20 minutes. Each time the screen lit up briefly. Each time he angled it slightly away before reading the message. Isla didn't comment. She simply watched the television. Eventually, Connor stood and stretched. "I'm going to head to bed," he said. "Long day tomorrow." Isla nodded. "Good night." "Night." Connor disappeared upstairs. The house became quiet again. Isla remained on the couch for several minutes after the television screen faded to black. Then she walked back to the dining table and reopened her laptop. She added another entry to her notebook. Madeline Pierce restaurant reservation forwarded email. The words looked small on the page, insignificant to anyone else. But Isla knew something important had changed. The story hidden inside Connor's explanations was beginning to reveal its structure. And once a structure exists, evidence eventually fills it. She closed the notebook slowly. Upstairs, Connor slept peacefully. Downstairs, Isla Carrington began paying attention with greater precision than ever before. Because now she wasn't just noticing irregularities, she was following them. By the time the corporate gala arrived, Isla Carrington had already collected enough small inconsistencies to understand that something in her marriage was changing. What she did not yet know was how large that change would be. The Redwood Urban Development Annual Foundation Gala was one of the company's most public events of the year. Investors, executives, city officials, and nonprofit partners gathered in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, a place known for chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the kind of quiet luxury that signaled importance without needing to say so. Connor had mentioned the event weeks earlier. It's mostly networking, he had told Isla while adjusting his cufflinks that evening. But spouses are encouraged to come. It'll look better if we attend together. Isla agreed. Not because appearances mattered to her, but because events like this revealed things that ordinary days often concealed. The ballroom was already filled with conversation when they arrived. Waiters moved between small clusters of guests, carrying trays of wine glasses. A string quartet played near the stage, their music blending with the low hum of professional politeness. Connor seemed instantly comfortable. He greeted people with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent years cultivating relationships. Investors shook his hand. Colleagues patted his shoulder. Several people greeted Isla warmly as well. "You must be Connor's wife," one board member said with a smile. "He talks about you." Isla returned the smile politely. Connor did talk about her, usually in ways that sounded impressive in public. For the first hour of the evening, everything followed the usual rhythm of corporate events. Short conversations, introductions, small jokes about construction timelines and city permits. Then Connor excused himself to speak with someone across the room. "I'll just be a minute," he said. Isla nodded and watched him move through the crowd. She didn't follow. Instead, she remained near one of the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan. From there, she could see most of the room without appearing to study it. Observation, after all, was easier when people believed you weren't paying attention. Connor stopped near the bar where a small group of Redwood employees had gathered. One woman stood among them, her posture relaxed, her laugh easy. Isla recognized her immediately, not because she had met her before, because she had seen the name, Madeline Pierce. The woman was striking in a way that drew attention without effort. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that emphasized sharp cheekbones and confident eyes. She wore a deep blue evening dress that stood out subtly against the black suits surrounding her. Connor approached the group. Madeline turned toward him. The moment was small, almost invisible in the crowded ballroom, but Isla noticed the way Madeline's expression changed. Recognition, familiarity, something slightly warmer than professional politeness. Connor said something Isla couldn't hear from across the room. Madeline laughed. Not the polite laugh people use in networking conversations, a genuine one. The kind people share when they know each other well. Isla watched Connor lean slightly closer as he spoke again. Not dramatically close, just close enough that someone paying careful attention might notice. Most people weren't paying attention. They were busy talking, drinking, discussing projects and city permits. But Isla was watching. A few minutes later, Connor gestured toward Isla's direction. Madeline followed his gaze. Their eyes met briefly across the ballroom. Connor raised a hand, inviting Isla to join them. Isla walked across the room calmly. By the time she reached the group, Connor had already begun the introduction. "Isla, this is Madeline Pierce," he said. "She runs marketing strategy for Redwood." Madeline extended her hand. "It's nice to finally meet you," she said warmly. Finally, the word was subtle, but Isla noticed it. "Nice to meet you as well," Isla replied. Madeline's handshake was firm, confident. Her smile remained steady, but her eyes studied Isla with a quick, careful assessment, the same way professionals evaluate new colleagues during first meetings. Connor stood between them, seemingly unaware of the quiet exchange taking place beneath the polite conversation. "We were just talking about the Denver expansion," he said. Madeline nodded. "Connor's project has been one of the most exciting developments we've worked on this year." Isla listened. Madeline spoke easily with the kind of polished communication skills that made marketing executives successful. Her tone balanced enthusiasm and intelligence carefully. But there were small details. Madeline occasionally finished Connor's sentences. Connor laughed at her comments more quickly than he did with others. Once, while reaching for a drink from the bar, their hands brushed briefly. The contact lasted less than a second. But neither of them reacted with surprise. It was a familiar motion. Isla didn't interrupt the conversation. She asked a few polite questions about Redwood's marketing campaigns. Madeline answered smoothly. From the outside, nothing about the interaction seemed unusual. Three professionals discussing work at a corporate gala. Yet Isla noticed something else. When Connor spoke to other colleagues earlier in the evening, he maintained a slight distance professional space. With Madeline, that space narrowed, not enough to attract attention, just enough that someone attentive might notice. Isla noticed. After a few minutes, another executive approached the group, pulling Connor into a discussion about upcoming zoning negotiations. Madeline turned toward Isla again. "You must get tired of all these real estate conversations," she said lightly. Isla shook her head. "Numbers are my field. Real estate usually comes with plenty of them." Madeline smiled. "That explains a lot. What, as Connor once mentioned, you're incredibly precise with financial analysis." Isla looked at her. Connor had mentioned that. When did he say that? Isla asked. Madeline paused, only briefly. "Oh, just during one of our planning meetings," she said. "He talks about you often." Again, the word, often. Isla nodded politely. "Connor enjoys talking." Madeline laughed softly. "Yes, he does." Across the room, Connor was still engaged in conversation with two investors. He appeared animated, gesturing as he explained something about development permits. Madeline followed Isla's gaze toward him. "He's very good at what he does," she said. "He is," Isla agreed. Madeline took a sip of her drink. "You must be proud." Isla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked back at Madeline. Madeline's expression remained friendly. But there was something else there. Confidence. The kind of quiet confidence people carry when they believe they understand a situation better than others. Isla recognized that expression. She had seen it in executives during audit investigations right before financial inconsistencies surfaced. "Connor works very hard," Isla said finally. Madeline nodded. "Yes," she said softly. For the rest of the evening, Isla moved through the ballroom beside Connor as expected. They spoke with investors. They listened to speeches about urban development and charitable partnerships. Connor seemed relaxed. Madeline appeared in different conversations throughout the night, always professional, always composed. But Isla noticed something else as the event progressed. Connor and Madeline rarely stood in the same group for long. Yet their paths crossed repeatedly. At the bar, near the stage, beside the dessert table. Each time the interaction was brief. Each time the familiarity was unmistakable. Most people would have dismissed it as workplace friendliness. Isla did not. When the gala finally ended, Connor and Isla stepped outside into the cool Chicago night. Connor exhaled with relief. "Those things always run longer than they should," he said. Isla glanced back once toward the hotel entrance. Madeline Pierce was standing near the doorway, speaking with another executive. Connor followed Isla's gaze. "Oh, Madeline," he said casually. "She's one of our most effective people." Isla nodded. "I noticed." Connor didn't realize how carefully she had noticed. As they walked toward their car, Isla was already reconstructing the evening in her mind. Names, conversations, small gestures. Details most people would forget before the next morning. But Isla Carrington rarely forgot details. And now, for the first time, the name in her notebook had a face. Madeline Pierce, Director of Marketing. Confident, comfortable around Connor. Perhaps too comfortable. Later that night, after Connor had gone to sleep, Isla opened her notebook again. She added 3 simple words beneath Madeline's name. Met at gala. Then she paused before writing one more. Watch carefully, because sometimes the truth doesn't hide. Sometimes it simply waits for someone patient enough to see it. After the gala at the Drake Hotel, Ela Carrington no longer needed to wonder whether something was wrong. She knew. Not the full truth yet, but enough of it to begin asking the right questions. The next morning arrived like any other weekday. Connor left early for work, moving through the kitchen with the efficient routine of someone who had repeated the same schedule for years. Coffee, a quick glance at his phone, a reminder about an upcoming meeting. "Long day today," he said, grabbing his jacket. "Probably won't be home until late." Ila stood by the counter rinsing a coffee mug. "That's fine," she replied calmly. Connor kissed her lightly on the cheek before leaving. The front door closed behind him with the same quiet sound it had made thousands of times before. But this time, Isla waited. Not seconds, minutes. She stood still in the kitchen, listening to the house settle into silence. Then she walked to the small office space at the back of the house and turned on her laptop. For years, Isla had spent her professional life analyzing financial behavior, tracing irregularities hidden inside ordinary transactions. Companies hired her firm to uncover fraud, misreporting, or financial manipulation that others failed to see. Those investigations always began the same way, with patterns. So that morning, Isla created one. She opened a spreadsheet and began building a timeline. Across the top, she labeled columns: date, transaction, location, Connor's explanation, verification. It was a simple structure, but simple structures often reveal the most. She started with the entries already recorded in her notebook: the Alinea dinner, the Sienna room charge, the supposed Boston trip that never existed. As she entered the information into the spreadsheet, the data began forming connections that her notebook alone could not show. Certain weeks contained multiple unexplained expenses. Certain cities appeared repeatedly. And more than once, the same name surfaced inside archived emails: Madeline Pierce. Isla did not assume anything yet. Assumptions could damage investigations. Instead, she expanded her search. Connor occasionally used the shared household computer to access his work email when his laptop needed software updates. Although he usually logged out afterward, archived files sometimes remained temporarily stored in the browser cache. Isla navigated carefully through the saved data. Eventually, she found a folder containing forwarded project documents Connor had once downloaded to review at home. Among those documents were several email threads involving Redwood's marketing department. Madeline Pierce appeared frequently. Her messages were efficient and professional. Most involved advertising strategies or public announcements for new development projects. Nothing unusual. But Isla noticed something subtle. Occasionally, Connor replied to Madeline late at night. Not during standard work hours. 10:48 p.m., 11:16 p.m. Once, even at 12:03 a.m., the messages themselves were brief. Short confirmations, small jokes about tight deadlines. But professional correspondence rarely continued past midnight unless something else connected the participants. Isla added those timestamps to the spreadsheet. Then she turned to something else: credit card records. Connor carried several cards, some personal, some issued by Redwood for company travel expenses. The company card statements were usually handled through his office, but occasionally confirmation emails arrived at his personal address when purchases were processed. Isla searched the archived inbox. Within minutes, she located several receipt confirmations: hotel bookings, airline tickets, restaurant reservations. One reservation caught her attention: the Hawthorne Suites, Boston. The date matched a weekend Connor had told her he was visiting his parents in Milwaukee. Isla opened the attached receipt. 2 guests, 3 nights. She stared at the screen quietly. Again, she did not react emotionally. Emotion blurred judgment. Instead, she copied the receipt and saved it to the folder she had labeled Archive. Then she added a new line to her spreadsheet: Hawthorne Suites Boston weekend trip explanation given Milwaukee visit. Next, she opened the airline account again. This time, she searched for flights to Boston during the same weekend. There was one. Connor had booked it through the Redwood corporate travel portal. Departure Friday afternoon, return Monday morning, 3 days, 3 nights. Isla added the flight confirmation to the folder. The pattern was growing, still incomplete, but unmistakable. The next step in any investigation was verification, so Isla began cross-checking the dates with Connor's calendar. Connor synchronized his work calendar with the home tablet in the kitchen, a habit that had once made coordinating schedules easier. Now it provided something else. Context. On the weekend of the Boston hotel reservation, Connor's calendar showed only one entry: client meeting out of town. No city listed, just a vague description. Isla added that to the spreadsheet as well. By noon, she had reconstructed nearly 4 lengths of Connor's travel activity. The picture that emerged was quiet but precise. 3 cities appeared repeatedly: Boston, Denver, Chicago. And within many of those trips, certain expenses overlapped. Restaurants, hotels, late-night communications, often involving the same name: Madeline Pierce. Isla leaned back in her chair and looked at the spreadsheet. No single entry proved anything. But together, they formed something much stronger. Consistency. Patterns rarely lie. Before closing her laptop, Isla did one more thing. She purchased a small external hard drive online. It would arrive in 2 days. Her work experience had taught her something important. Data needed protection, especially when it involved someone who might eventually try to erase it. Later that evening, Connor returned home later than usual. Nearly 9 o'clock. He walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie, exhaustion visible in his posture. "Long meeting," he said. Isla was sitting at the dining table with a book open. "Successful?" she asked. Connor shrugged. "We'll see." He opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. "Did you do anything interesting today?" he asked casually. "Work," Isla replied. Connor nodded. He seemed distracted. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and checked a message. A faint smile crossed his face. Isla noticed. Then Connor locked the phone again quickly. For most people, the moment would have passed unnoticed. For Isla, it became another entry. Later that night, when Connor had gone upstairs, Isla returned to the spreadsheet one final time. She reviewed the entries slowly. The information no longer looked random. It looked organized, predictable, which meant something else. Connor believed no one was watching. That belief had allowed him to repeat the same behaviors again and again, without caution. But now, someone was watching. And Isla Carrington had just begun following the numbers. By the time Connor Carrington finally asked for the divorce, Isla had already been expecting the moment. Not the exact day, not the exact words, but the direction of things had become clear weeks earlier. Patterns rarely stopped halfway. They continued until something forced them to end. Connor, however, seemed to believe the decision was entirely his. It happened on a Tuesday evening in early autumn. The Chicago air had begun to cool, and the light outside their kitchen windows faded earlier each day. Isla had just finished preparing dinner: roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, and a small salad she placed at the center of the table. Connor arrived home earlier than usual. That alone was unusual. He walked through the front door with a quietness that felt deliberate, as though he had rehearsed the moment in his mind during the drive home. His jacket was folded neatly over his arm instead of thrown across the chair as he normally did. "Hey," he said. "Hi," Isla replied from the kitchen. Connor washed his hands and joined her at the table. For several minutes, they ate in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, just the familiar quiet that had gradually replaced the conversations they once shared. Connor finished his water before speaking. "Isla," he said carefully. She looked up. His expression was composed, almost professional. "We should talk." Isla placed her fork down. "All right." Connor leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling as if preparing for something difficult. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he began, "and I think it's time we're honest about where we are." Isla waited. Connor continued. "I don't think our marriage is working anymore." The sentence arrived exactly the way such sentences often do, calm, controlled, designed to sound reasonable rather than cruel. Connor spoke as if he were describing a business decision. "We've grown apart," he added. Isla studied his face quietly. "How long have you felt that way?" she asked. Connor glanced down briefly as if calculating the safest answer. "A few months," he said. The number was carefully chosen. Not too long, not too short. Isla already knew it was false. Her spreadsheet covered nearly 2 years of irregularities. But she did not correct him. Instead, she asked another question. "And what do you want to do?" Connor seemed relieved by her calm tone. "I think it would be best if we ended things amicably," he said. "No fighting, no unnecessary complications." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a thin folder on the table. "I've already spoken with a lawyer," he continued. He helped prepare the initial paperwork. The folder remained unopened between them. Connor's voice softened slightly. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Isla. I just think we both deserve a chance to move forward." Isla rested her hands on the table. "Move forward," she repeated. Connor nodded. Yes. There was a brief pause. Connor seemed to expect anger, or tears, or accusations. Instead, Isla asked a question that surprised him. "When did you speak to the lawyer?" Connor hesitated. "Recently." How recently? Connor cleared his throat. "A few weeks ago." Another carefully selected answer. Isla nodded slowly. "I see." Connor leaned forward, mistaking her calmness for agreement. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable," he said. "We'll split the assets fairly. The house can be sold or transferred, whatever makes the most sense." He spoke confidently now, outlining a plan he clearly believed would be accepted without resistance. "No drawn-out court battles," he continued. "It'll be easier for both of us." Isla listened. Connor's proposal sounded organized, efficient, prepared. Which meant something else. He had expected this conversation to go smoothly. Isla finally reached for the folder and opened it. Inside were several pages of legal documents: petition for dissolution of marriage, financial disclosure forms, preliminary asset division suggestions. Connor had already filled in much of the information. He had listed the house, their shared savings account, 2 retirement funds, a few investment accounts. At first glance, it appeared thorough. But Isla noticed something missing immediately. Several accounts she had discovered during her investigation were not listed. Not the Boston investment account, not the corporate shell company Connor had used for certain transfers, not the travel expenses charged through Redwood's corporate system. Connor watched her carefully as she reviewed the documents. "You can take some time to look through everything," he said. "There's no rush." Isla closed the folder. "All right," she said. Connor blinked. "All right," he repeated. "Yes." Connor seemed momentarily uncertain. "You're okay with this?" Isla stood and carried her empty plate to the sink. "I understand your decision," she replied. Connor followed her into the kitchen. "I expected this conversation to be harder," he admitted. Isla turned on the faucet. "Did you?" Connor studied her expression. "You're not angry?" Isla dried her hands with a towel. "No." Connor seemed relieved. "That's good," he said quickly. "It'll make everything easier." Isla did not respond. Connor glanced at the clock. "I have an early meeting tomorrow," he said. "But we can go over the paperwork this weekend if you want." "That's fine." Connor nodded again, visibly satisfied. "I'm glad we're handling this like adults." He picked up his jacket and headed upstairs. From his perspective, the conversation had gone better than expected. There had been no confrontation, no emotional outburst, just quiet acceptance. What Connor did not understand was that Isla Carrington had already moved past the stage where arguments mattered. While Connor prepared paperwork for an easy divorce, Isla had spent weeks collecting evidence. Evidence Connor didn't know existed. Later that night, after Connor had fallen asleep, Isla returned to the small office at the back of the house. She opened her laptop. The spreadsheet appeared on the screen exactly where she had left it. Dozens of entries now filled the rows. Transactions, travel dates, names. Isla opened the folder labeled Archive. Inside were copies of restaurant reservations, hotel confirmations, flight itineraries, email threads, financial transfers, everything organized by date, everything preserved. Then she opened a new document. At the top she typed, "Next step, legal counsel." Connor believed the divorce would be simple, clean, quick. He believed Isla had accepted his explanation that their marriage had simply grown apart. What Connor did not realize was that the story he had written for himself contained missing chapters, and Isla Carrington had been quietly writing them down for months. She closed the laptop. Upstairs, Connor slept peacefully, certain the hardest part of the divorce was already behind him. Downstairs, Isla began preparing for something Connor had not anticipated: the truth. And in matters involving money, truth often carried consequences far beyond the end of a marriage. Connor Carrington believed he had taken control of the situation the moment he placed the divorce papers on the dining table. From his perspective, the next steps were simple. Isla would review the documents, perhaps ask a few questions, and eventually sign them. Lawyers would handle the formalities. The house would be sold or divided. Assets would be distributed. Life would move forward. What Connor did not realize was that Isla Carrington had already stepped into a different phase of the process entirely, one that involved someone he had never met. 3 days after the divorce conversation, Isla left her office during lunch and walked 4 blocks south through downtown Chicago. The building she entered was older than most of the surrounding towers, 12 floors of limestone and narrow windows that suggested a quieter kind of business operated inside. On the directory near the lobby elevator, one name appeared in modest lettering. David Whitaker, family law attorney. Isla stepped inside the elevator and pressed the 7th floor button. The office suite was smaller than the large corporate firms Connor was likely familiar with. A receptionist sat behind a wooden desk near the entrance, typing steadily on a computer. "Good afternoon," the woman said with a polite smile. "I have an appointment with Mr. Whitaker," Isla replied. "Miss Carrington?" "Yes, he's expecting you. Please go right in." David Whitaker's office was lined with bookshelves filled with legal volumes that had clearly been used often. Case law binders rested beside framed certificates and photographs of courtrooms. Whitaker himself stood when Isla entered. He was in his early 50s, with silver beginning to appear along his temples and a calm, observant expression that suggested he listened more than he spoke. "Miss Carrington," he said, extending his hand, "please have a seat." Isla sat across from his desk. Whitaker noticed immediately that she had brought something with her: a small external hard drive, a thin folder, and a notebook. "Most clients begin these meetings by telling me what happened," Whitaker said gently. Isla placed the folder on the desk. "I thought it might be more useful if I showed you first." Whitaker raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing as she opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of financial records, credit card statements, email confirmations, hotel reservations. Each document had been highlighted carefully. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and began reading. The room remained quiet, except for the soft sound of turning pages. After several minutes, he leaned back in his chair. "How long have you been collecting this information?" he asked. 4 months, Isla said. Whitaker nodded slowly. "Your husband recently filed for divorce," he asked for one, Isla replied. "The paperwork hasn't been submitted to the court yet." Whitaker flipped through several more pages. "These hotel reservations," he said. "Were they disclosed in his financial statement?" "Naman." Whitaker turned to the next document. "And these accounts, also not disclosed." Whitaker opened the small notebook Isla had brought. Inside were entries written in precise handwriting, dates, transactions, explanations Connor had given for each expense. Whitaker studied the entries carefully. "You're an auditor," he said. "Yes, I can tell." Whitaker closed the notebook. "Most people come to me after discovering something emotional," he said. "Affairs, arguments, broken trust. But what you've brought me is something different. He tapped the folder. This is financial concealment. Isla remained quiet. Whitaker continued reviewing the documents. Eventually, he reached the spreadsheet Isla had printed and organized into chronological order. Connor's financial behavior now appeared in a clear timeline. Travel expenses, restaurant charges, account transfers, each entry connected to another. Whitaker let out a quiet breath. "This is thorough," he said. Isla folded her hands calmly. "I wanted to understand the full picture before speaking to a lawyer." Whitaker nodded again. That was wise. He stood and walked to one of the bookshelves behind his desk, pulling out a thick legal reference binder. When he returned to his chair, his tone had changed slightly, more serious. "Let me explain something important," he said. Isla listened. In divorce proceedings, both parties are legally required to disclose all financial assets, every account, every investment, every major expense. Whitaker opened the binder and turned it toward her. If someone intentionally hides assets during a divorce, the court views that as financial fraud. Isla nodded slightly. That's what I suspected. Whitaker tapped one of the highlighted bank transfers in her file. These transactions suggest your husband moved significant funds into accounts not listed in the divorce paperwork. Yes. Do you know the total amount, approximately $300,000? Whitaker's eyebrows lifted slightly. That changes things considerably. He closed the binder. "Miss Carrington, if this information is verified in court, your husband could face serious legal consequences." Ayla did not react outwardly. Whitaker continued. "The judge would likely reopen the asset division process entirely. In some cases, the court awards a larger share of marital assets to the spouse who was deceived." He paused before adding one more point. "And depending on how those funds were transferred, it could also trigger investigations into corporate misuse of company accounts." Isla had already considered that possibility. Connor had used Redwood's corporate credit card for several personal expenses during the trips she had documented. Whitaker studied her expression. "You seem very calm about all of this." "I prefer understanding situations before reacting to them," Isla said. Whitaker allowed a small smile. "That approach tends to work well in court." He leaned forward slightly. "However, we need to be careful." "Careful, yes." Whitaker folded his hands. "If your husband realizes you've discovered these financial transfers, he might try to move the remaining funds or erase records." Isla nodded. "That's why I saved copies?" Whitaker looked again at the external hard drive. Good. He considered the evidence one more time. Then he said something important. "For now, I recommend we do nothing." Isla looked at him. "Nothing," Whitaker nodded. "Let him believe you're cooperating with the divorce. Why? Because the longer he believes that, the more likely he is to continue behaving exactly as he has been." Whitaker tapped the folder again. "And every additional transaction becomes another piece of evidence." Isla understood immediately. The investigation wasn't finished. It had just gained legal support. Whitaker closed the folder carefully. "When the time comes," he said, "we will present everything to the court in the proper legal order." Isla stood, preparing to leave. Whitaker added one final sentence before she reached the door. "Miss Carrington." She turned. "Your husband thinks he's ending a marriage." Whitaker glanced down at the documents again. "But what you've brought me today suggests he may have started something else entirely." Isla picked up the external drive. What would that be? Whitaker met her eyes. "A legal problem." Isla left the office quietly. Outside, Chicago traffic moved steadily through the afternoon streets. People hurried past, unaware that somewhere nearby a marriage was dissolving, and that one of the people involved had been quietly preparing for months. Connor Carrington believed the divorce would be simple. But he had not yet realized something important. Isla Carrington had never been interested in simple answers, only accurate ones. And the truth she was assembling was becoming more precise every day. After meeting with David Whitaker, Isla Carrington did exactly what her attorney had advised. She did nothing, At least, nothing visible. Connor continued to believe their divorce was moving toward a calm and reasonable conclusion. Papers were discussed casually over dinner once or twice that week. Connor spoke about logistics, how the house might be sold, how bank accounts could be divided, how their retirement funds might be adjusted. He spoke like a man closing a chapter of his life with efficiency. But Isla listened. She asked a few practical questions. She made no accusations. To Connor, her calmness confirmed what he had hoped from the beginning, that the divorce would be uncomplicated. What he did not understand was that Isla had simply shifted her focus. She was no longer searching for answers. Now she was verifying them. 3 days after her meeting with Whitaker, the external hard drive she had ordered arrived in a small package on the front porch. Isla opened it that evening after Connor had gone upstairs. The device was simple black compact designed for secure data storage. She connected it to her laptop and created 3 folders immediately. Financial records, travel documentation, correspondence. Then she began copying files. Bank statements, credit card histories, flight itineraries, hotel reservations, email threads involving Connor and Madeline Pierce. Each document was organized chronologically. Every file name included a date and a short description. Isla had spent years preparing financial evidence for corporate audits. She understood that the value of documentation depended not only on its accuracy, but on its clarity. A judge, after all, had limited time. Evidence needed to tell its story quickly. As midnight approached, Isla reviewed the spreadsheet again. The pattern she had discovered earlier was now easier to see. Connor's unexplained travel followed a rhythm, roughly every 3 weeks. Chicago, Boston, Denver. Sometimes the trips were described as work conferences, sometimes as investor meetings. But Isla had already verified that many of those meetings had never been scheduled by Redwood Urban Development, which meant the travel served another purpose. Madeline Pierce appeared repeatedly within the same timeline. Emails exchanged late at night. Restaurant reservations, marketing conferences that Connor attended even though his department rarely participated in those events. Isla highlighted the overlapping dates. The pattern sharpened. 2 weeks later, the pattern confirmed itself again. One evening, Connor entered the house while loosening his tie, his posture slightly lighter than usual. "I've got to travel next week," he said casually while placing his keys on the counter. "Where to?" Isla asked. "Denver." Connor opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of sparkling water. "Just a quick project review," he added. "Probably 2 nights." Isla nodded. "When do you leave Wednesday afternoon?" Connor drank from the bottle, then checked his phone briefly. The faint smile that appeared on his face lasted only a moment before disappearing again. But Isla saw it. Later that night, after Connor had gone upstairs, Isla opened the airline rewards account again. Within minutes, she found the booking: Chicago to Denver. Departure Wednesday, 4:10 p.m. Return Saturday morning. 3 nights, not 2. Isla downloaded the confirmation. Then she opened Connor's corporate travel receipts again. Another reservation appeared shortly afterward. The Crawford Hotel, Denver, 3 nights. 2 guests. Isla saved the file without hesitation. The pattern continued. 2 days before Connor's trip, another email appeared in the archived inbox. It was brief, from Madeline Pierce. Subject line: "See you soon." The message contained only 1 sentence. "Looking forward to a quieter city this time." Isla read the email twice. Then she saved it to the external drive. Connor left for Denver on Wednesday exactly as planned. He kissed Isla goodbye at the front door. "Back Saturday morning," he said. "Safe travels," Isla replied. Connor wheeled his suitcase toward the waiting rideshare car and disappeared down the street. Isla waited until the car turned the corner before returning inside. Then she opened her laptop. David Whitaker had advised her not to confront Connor yet. Instead, he encouraged her to continue documenting. "Patterns grow stronger over time," he had said during their last call. And the Denver trip added several new entries. Thursday evening, Isla received an automatic travel notification from their shared airline account. Connor had upgraded his return flight to first class. A small expense, but unusual. Connor rarely paid for upgrades unless the company reimbursed him. Isla added the receipt to the folder. Friday morning brought another confirmation. Dinner reservation. A restaurant inside the Crawford Hotel. 2 guests. Isla saved that as well. By the time Connor returned Saturday morning, Isla's timeline had grown longer, more complete. Connor entered the house carrying his suitcase and looking slightly tired. "Good trip?" Isla asked from the kitchen. "Busy," he said. He set the suitcase near the stairs and loosened his collar. "Meetings ran longer than expected." Isla nodded. "Denver can be unpredictable." Connor smiled faintly. "You've been there once." Connor glanced toward the kitchen counter where Isla's laptop sat closed. "You working this weekend?" he asked. "Just catching up on a few reports." Connor poured himself a cup of coffee. The house felt calm, ordinary, exactly the way Connor wanted it. Later that afternoon, Connor left again, saying he needed to stop by the Redwood office to review a project file. Isla watched him leave through the front window. Then she returned to the office at the back of the house. Her laptop opened to the spreadsheet automatically. She entered the final details from the Denver trip: flight, hotel, dinner reservation, email. The timeline now stretched across several months. When viewed together, the entries formed something undeniable. Not just an affair, a financial trail. Connor had paid for many of the trips using company accounts before transferring reimbursements through private funds. The process created layers of transactions, but layers could be traced. Isla leaned back and studied the screen. For the first time since beginning her investigation, she allowed herself to consider the larger consequences. Connor believed he was ending a marriage, but his financial decisions had created something more complicated: corporate expense misuse, hidden investment accounts, undisclosed assets during divorce proceedings. Each of those issues carried legal implications. David Whitaker had explained them carefully. And now the evidence supporting those implications was growing. Isla closed the laptop. Outside, evening light stretched across the quiet street. Connor would return later, unaware that every trip, every receipt, every quiet email exchange had already become part of a much larger record. A record that was still expanding. And when the time came for that record to appear in court, it would tell a story Connor had never expected anyone to read. Confidence can be a quiet thing. It rarely announces itself with loud declarations. Instead, it appears in the way people carry themselves when they believe the future is already decided. By the time winter approached Chicago, Connor Carrington had begun carrying that kind of confidence. The divorce paperwork had moved forward exactly the way he expected. His attorney, Richard Sloan, had filed the initial petition with the Cook County Family Court. Preliminary disclosures had been exchanged, though Connor's version of disclosure was far from complete. To Connor, however, the process seemed smooth. Isla had not argued. She had not accused him of anything. She had simply reviewed the documents and told him her attorney would respond soon. Connor interpreted her silence as cooperation. And silence, when misunderstood, often becomes the most dangerous form of patience. Meanwhile, something else in Connor's life had begun to change. Madeline Pierce was no longer careful. At first, their relationship had been hidden behind business travel and quiet dinners in distant cities. But once Connor believed the divorce was inevitable, the secrecy began to fade. One evening in early December, Redwood Urban Development hosted a small industry reception at a modern rooftop lounge overlooking the Chicago River. Connor attended as usual. But this time Madeline arrived with him. Not openly as a couple, not officially, but they entered the room together. To most people, it appeared natural. After all, both of them worked for Redwood. It wasn't unusual for colleagues to attend events side by side. Still, those who observed carefully noticed something. Connor's attention rarely drifted far from Madeline. He introduced her to investors. He laughed easily when she spoke. At one point, when a group gathered near the bar, Connor placed his hand briefly on the small of her back while guiding her through the crowd. The gesture lasted only a moment, but moments reveal more than explanations. Across the room, a few Redwood employees exchanged quiet glances. Corporate offices are skilled at detecting relationships long before anyone confirms them. Whispers rarely travel loudly, but they travel quickly. Connor, however, seemed unconcerned. He had already convinced himself that his personal life was transitioning smoothly into a new chapter. Later that evening, Madeline leaned against the glass railing overlooking the river, while Connor stood beside her holding 2 glasses of wine. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Connor smiled. "About what?" "The divorce." Connor shook his head. "No." Madeline studied him. "You seem very certain." Connor handed her the second glass. "Isla isn't the kind of person who creates drama," he said. Madeline raised an eyebrow. "Not even after 11 years of marriage." Connor shrugged slightly. "She's practical." Madeline took a sip of wine. And the financial side, Connor's confidence didn't waver. "My lawyer handled it," he replied. Madeline nodded slowly. She didn't ask more questions. Connor mistook her silence for admiration. Across the city that same evening, Isla Carrington sat quietly in her office, reviewing another set of documents. The spreadsheet on her screen had grown significantly since the day she first created it. What had once been a handful of suspicious entries had become a detailed financial map. Every unexplained expense, every hidden account, every trip involving Connor and Madeline. And now there were more. After the Denver trip, Connor had continued transferring funds into the same investment account Isla had discovered months earlier. The amounts were small enough individually to avoid attention. $5,000, $8,000, $10,000. But together, they now exceeded $400,000. Isla had verified each transfer. David Whitaker had also begun reviewing the records. 2 days earlier, he had called her after examining the newest files. "This is becoming stronger than I expected," he had said. "Stronger?" Isla asked. "Yes," Whitaker explained carefully. When a spouse hides assets during a divorce, the court considers that a serious violation of disclosure rules. Isla listened, but when the hidden assets continue moving during the legal process, Whitaker continued, it becomes even more problematic. Isla understood immediately. Connor believed the financial investigation had ended. In reality, it had only expanded. That evening, Isla saved the newest bank statement to the external drive. Then she added several more lines to the spreadsheet. Date, transaction amount, account number, transfer destination. Everything aligned with the earlier pattern. Connor was moving money gradually, preparing for life after the divorce. What he did not know was that every movement was now recorded. 3 nights later, Connor arrived home unusually cheerful. He hung his coat near the door and walked into the kitchen where Isla was reading at the table. "You should come to the Redwood holiday party next week," he said casually. Isla looked up. "I thought spouses weren't attending this year." Connor hesitated. "Well, some are." Isla closed her book slowly. "Will Madeline Pierce be there?" Connor blinked. "Yes," he said after a moment. "She works there." Isla nodded. "Then I think it's better if I don't attend." Connor seemed relieved. "That might be simpler." He poured himself a drink and leaned against the counter. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I'm glad we're handling all this calmly." Isla said nothing. Connor continued. "Some divorces turn into wars." Isla looked at him. "Do they?" Connor laughed lightly. "All the time." He had no idea how close his statement was to something else entirely. Not a war, but a reckoning. Later that night, Isla sent a short email to David Whitaker. Attached were the newest bank statements. Within an hour, Whitaker replied, "The timeline is now very clear. Continue documenting. The court will want the full sequence." Isla read the message twice. Then she closed the laptop. Across the city, Connor Carrington believed his life was steadily improving. His marriage was ending quietly. His relationship with Madeline was growing more visible. His financial plans were moving forward exactly the way he intended. Confidence, after all, can be a comfortable illusion. But illusions rarely survive contact with evidence. And the evidence surrounding Connor Carrington was now too extensive to remain hidden much longer. Isla Carrington knew that. Connor did not. Not yet. By January, the divorce had moved fully into the legal phase. Documents had been filed. Financial disclosures had been exchanged. And a preliminary court hearing had been scheduled at the Cook County Family Court to review the case. From Connor Carrington's perspective, everything was unfolding exactly as planned. His attorney, Richard Sloan, had reassured him that the case appeared straightforward. "Your wife doesn't seem interested in contesting anything," Sloan said during one of their meetings in a glass-walled office overlooking downtown Chicago. "If both parties cooperate, the court usually moves these cases quickly." Connor nodded, satisfied. "That's what I expected." Sloan flipped through a stack of documents. "She hired an attorney, though." Connor shrugged. "That's normal." "Yes," Sloan agreed. "But her lawyer has been thorough." Connor frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Sloan tapped one page with his pen. "David Whitaker." Connor recognized the name vaguely. "Small firm," Sloan added. "Family law specialist." Connor leaned back in his chair. "That shouldn't be a problem." Sloan didn't immediately respond. Instead, he closed the file and slid it aside. "Probably not," he said. Connor left the meeting confident. He believed the legal process would simply confirm what he had already decided. Meanwhile, across the city, Isla Carrington sat inside David Whitaker's office, reviewing something very different. Whitaker had spread several printed documents across the desk. Bank records, corporate expense reports, transfer confirmations. Each page represented a small piece of a much larger pattern. Whitaker adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the timeline again. "Your husband has made another transfer," he said. Isla nodded. "Last week?" Whitaker pointed to the highlighted amount. $12,000. He flipped to another page. And 3 days earlier, $8,000. Isla had already added those entries to the spreadsheet. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "Do you know how judges tend to view this behavior?" Isla folded her hands calmly. "Poorly." Whitaker allowed a small smile. "That's an accurate summary." He tapped the stack of papers again. "This is no longer just an undisclosed account. It's an ongoing effort to move marital assets during a pending divorce." Whitaker paused. "That matters." Isla remained quiet. Whitaker continued. "We're preparing the full evidence package now." He opened a large folder labeled Carrington v. Carrington. Inside were carefully organized sections, financial records, email correspondence, travel documentation, audio files. The evidence had grown significantly since their first meeting. Whitaker turned one of the pages toward Isla. "This section documents the timeline of your husband's financial transfers." Another page showed hotel receipts. "And this section shows the trips connected to those transfers." Isla studied the documents. Every detail she had collected now appeared inside a structured legal file. Whitaker turned to the final section. "And here," he said, "is the part your husband probably never expected." He pressed a key on his laptop. A short audio recording began playing from the speaker. Connor's voice filled the office. "We'll just move the funds before everything's finalized. Once the divorce is done, it won't matter where the money was originally." The voice on the other end of the recording responded with a quiet laugh. "Madeline Pierce. Smart," she said. The recording ended. Whitaker closed the laptop. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Isla answered calmly. It was a voicemail forwarded to Connor's personal email. He deleted it from the phone, but the email copy remained in the archive. Whitaker nodded slowly. That kind of statement carries weight in court. He leaned forward slightly. "Your husband believes he's managing a simple divorce negotiation." Whitaker tapped the folder. "But legally speaking, he's been building a fraud case against himself." Isla didn't smile. She only nodded. Whitaker stood and walked to the window overlooking the busy Chicago street below. "Here's how the hearing will work," he said. He turned back toward her. "The first session is usually procedural. The judge reviews disclosures and determines whether both parties have been transparent." Isla listened carefully. Whitaker continued. "If the court suspects hidden assets, the judge can request additional documentation." He picked up the thick folder again. "And when we provide this material, the situation changes." "How?" Isla asked. Whitaker's expression grew serious. "The court will likely pause the proceedings and conduct a deeper financial review." He paused before adding something important. "Your husband's attorney will not be happy." Isla considered that for a moment. "That's not my concern." Whitaker nodded approvingly. "Exactly." He closed the folder. "We won't present everything immediately." Isla looked at him. No, Whitaker shook his head. "Timing matters." He explained carefully. "If we submit the evidence too early, Connor's legal team may attempt to explain or reframe it before the judge fully understands the pattern." Isla understood. "So we wait." Whitaker smiled slightly. "Yes." He placed the folder into a locked cabinet. "We let the court ask questions first." That evening, Connor returned home carrying a new sense of excitement. Madeline had recently begun talking openly about their future together. Dinner plans, trips they might take once the divorce was finalized. Connor believed the hardest part of the transition was nearly finished. When he entered the kitchen, Isla was sitting at the table reviewing a report. "The hearing is scheduled for next Thursday," he said casually. "I know," Isla replied. Connor nodded. "My lawyer says it should be quick." Isla closed the report. "Good." Connor poured himself a drink. "You're still okay with everything?" he asked. "Yes." Connor seemed relieved. "That makes this much easier." Isla watched him quietly. Connor believed the courtroom would be a formality, a final step before his new life began. But inside David Whitaker's locked cabinet sat a file containing months of evidence. Evidence Connor had unknowingly created himself. And when the time came for that evidence to be opened in court, the quiet simplicity Connor expected would disappear. Because legal procedures have a way of revealing truths that private conversations never do. And in this case, the truth was already organized, documented, and waiting. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of Chicago winter day when the sky looked like a sheet of dull steel stretched over the city. Connor Carrington arrived at the Cook County Family Court building just before 9. He stepped out of a rideshare car, wearing a tailored dark coat and carrying a leather folder containing the documents his attorney had prepared. The courthouse stood tall and quiet against the wind, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of legal arguments and quiet verdicts. Connor climbed those steps with the calm confidence of someone who believed the day would end quickly. Inside the lobby was busy but orderly. Lawyers moved between security checkpoints carrying briefcases. Couples sat along the walls waiting for their cases to be called. Some spoke quietly to their attorneys. Others stared at the floor in exhausted silence. Divorce courts rarely contain celebration. Connor scanned the room briefly until he spotted Richard Sloan standing near the elevators. Sloan nodded when he saw him. "Right on time," the attorney said as Connor approached. Connor shook his hand. "Is everything ready?" Sloan adjusted his glasses. "Yes. This is a preliminary financial review hearing, mostly procedural." Connor exhaled slowly. "That's what I thought." Sloan studied him for a moment. "Have you heard from Isla since the filings?" "Not much," Connor said. "She's letting her lawyer handle it." Sloan nodded. "That's typical." They stepped into the elevator along with 2 other attorneys and rode quietly to the 6th floor where the family courtrooms were located. Outside courtroom 6B, several people were already waiting. Connor noticed Isla almost immediately. She was seated on a bench near the far wall wearing a simple dark coat, her posture straight, her expression calm. Beside her sat David Whitaker. Connor had never met him before, but the older man's calm presence made it easy to identify him as Isla's attorney. Whitaker held a thick folder on his lap. Connor glanced at it briefly before turning to Sloane. That must be him. Sloane followed Connor's gaze. Yes. Whitaker noticed them looking and nodded politely. Professional courtesy. Nothing more. Isla did not look up. Connor felt a strange moment of curiosity. She seemed exactly the same as she had during their last conversation at home. Quiet, controlled, not angry. Connor interpreted that calmness as acceptance. From his perspective, Isla had already emotionally detached from the marriage, which meant the legal process should move smoothly. The courtroom doors opened shortly after 9:30. A clerk stepped out and called several case numbers. Carrington versus Carrington. Sloane touched Connor's arm lightly. That's us. They entered the courtroom. The room was smaller than Connor expected. Wooden benches filled the back rows. The judge's bench stood elevated at the front beneath the state seal. Judge Evelyn Harper sat already reviewing a stack of case files. She was known in Chicago legal circles as someone who valued clarity and disliked unnecessary drama. Connor and Sloane took their place at one table. Across the aisle, Isla and Whitaker sat quietly. The clerk called the case again for the record. Case number 24D-1187. Carrington versus Carrington. Dissolution of marriage. Judge Harper looked up. Good morning. Good morning, Your Honor, both attorneys replied. Harper scanned the file briefly. This is a preliminary hearing regarding financial disclosures, she said. Sloane stepped forward. That's correct, Your Honor. Harper nodded. Both parties have submitted initial disclosures. Sloane answered first. Yes, Your Honor. Whitaker followed. Yes, Your Honor. Harper flipped through several pages in the file. Connor watched calmly. This was the part Sloane had described, routine verification. The judge would confirm that both parties had listed their assets and debts. If everything appeared straightforward, the case would move toward settlement. Harper continued reviewing the documents. Connor noticed her pause briefly on one page, then another. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines of numbers. After a moment, she looked up. Mr. Carrington, she said. Connor straightened slightly. Yes, Your Honor. Harper tapped the file lightly. These are your financial disclosures, yes. Harper studied him for a moment. And you confirmed that they are complete and accurate. Connor nodded confidently. Yes, Your Honor. Across the room, Isla remained silent. Whitaker did not move. Harper returned to the file. Connor relaxed slightly. Everything appeared normal, exactly as expected. The judge turned another page, then another. Her expression remained neutral, but Connor noticed something subtle. She had begun reading more slowly. Finally, Harper closed the file and looked toward Whitaker. Counselor Whitaker, she said. Yes, Your Honor. Do you have any additional information regarding these disclosures? Whitaker stood calmly. Your Honor, we do. Connor's attention sharpened slightly. Whitaker reached down and lifted the thick folder he had carried into the courtroom. The folder looked larger now that it was resting on the table. Whitaker opened it slowly. Connor felt the first faint sensation of unease. Not fear, just curiosity. Whitaker spoke clearly. Your Honor, my client has prepared supplemental documentation regarding financial transactions that were not included in Mr. Carrington's disclosures. Connor's eyebrows drew together. Sloane turned toward him briefly. What transactions? Connor whispered. Sloane raised a hand slightly. Let me handle it. At the judge's bench, Harper leaned forward. What kind of documentation? Whitaker placed the first stack of papers on the evidence table. Bank transfers, Your Honor. Another stack followed. Travel expenses. Then another. Email correspondence related to those transactions. Connor's chest tightened slightly. Sloane stood quickly. Your Honor, we haven't been provided with these documents in advance. Whitaker responded calmly. They were submitted to the clerk this morning as supplemental evidence. Judge Harper held up a hand. That's sufficient, Counselor. The courtroom grew quiet. Harper opened the top document Whitaker had submitted. Connor felt something shift in the room. Something subtle, but unmistakable. The judge's eyes moved across the page. Then she picked up another document, and another. Each page revealed something Connor had assumed no one would ever connect together. Bank transfers, hotel receipts, flight confirmations. For the first time that morning, Connor Carrington felt uncertainty enter the room with him. He glanced across the aisle. Isla was still sitting calmly beside Whitaker. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. She had not spoken a single word since entering the courtroom. And yet the folder now resting in front of the judge told a story Connor had never intended anyone to read. Judge Harper adjusted her glasses and looked up again. "Mr. Carrington," she said. Connor straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper tapped the document in front of her. "We're going to need to discuss these financial records." Connor's confident morning had just begun to change. For a moment after Judge Harper spoke, the courtroom remained completely silent. Connor Carrington sat perfectly still at the table beside his attorney, his mind attempting to catch up with what had just happened. Only a few minutes earlier, the hearing had felt routine procedural, almost administrative. Now the judge was holding a stack of documents he had never expected to see in that room. Judge Harper lowered her eyes again to the page in front of her. The paper made a faint sound as she turned it, then another. Connor felt the quiet weight of every second. Across the aisle, Isla Carrington remained seated beside David Whitaker. Her posture composed, her expression unchanged. She did not look at Connor. She did not look at the judge. She simply waited. Judge Harper read the first page carefully. Then she picked up the next document. "This appears to be a transfer record," she said slowly, her voice carrying across the courtroom. Whitaker nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper examined the numbers. $85,000, she said. Transferred from a joint marital account into a private investment account. She lifted her gaze toward Connor. "Mr. Carrington, this account is not listed in your financial disclosure." Connor opened his mouth, then hesitated. Richard Sloane leaned slightly toward him and whispered quietly. "Don't answer yet." Sloane stood. "Your Honor, we would need to review the authenticity of these documents before responding." Judge Harper did not seem surprised by the objection. "That's reasonable," she said. She returned her attention to the next page. "This document appears to show a second transfer, $32,000. She turned another page. And another $12,000. Connor felt a tightening in his chest. He recognized the transactions. At the time they had felt harmless, strategic, temporary. Money moved gradually into a separate investment account he had opened months earlier. The account was meant to provide security for the future he planned with Madeline once the divorce was complete. Connor had believed the transfers were careful enough to avoid attention. Apparently, they had not been. Judge Harper continued reading. "These transactions span approximately 8 months, she said. Whitaker nodded. "That is correct, Your Honor." Harper placed the documents on the bench. "Counselor Sloane," she said. Sloane stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor." "Are you aware of this account?" Sloane hesitated only briefly. "I would need to confirm with my client." Harper nodded. "Then we will confirm it now." The judge looked directly at Connor again. "Mr. Carrington, are you the owner of the investment account listed in these documents?" Connor felt Sloane's hand press lightly against his arm. But the judge was waiting. "Yes," Connor said carefully. Harper tilted her head slightly. "And why was this account not included in your disclosure?" Connor's thoughts moved quickly. "It was recently opened," he said. Harper looked down again at the documents. "This account appears to have been active for at least 8 months. Connor's explanation collapsed almost immediately. Sloane cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may, my client may not have realized the account needed to be listed if it contained funds he considered separate from the marital estate." Judge Harper looked unimpressed. "Funds transferred from a joint marital account are not separate," she said calmly. Connor felt heat rise slightly along the back of his neck. Across the room, Isla remained motionless. Whitaker had not spoken since presenting the documents. He did not need to. The evidence was speaking. Judge Harper picked up another page. "This next section concerns travel expenses," she said. Connor felt something else shift. The judge examined the document closely. "Multiple hotel reservations in Boston," she continued. Then she turned another page. "And Denver." Another page followed. "These reservations list 2 guests." Connor's stomach tightened. Harper looked toward Whitaker. "Counselor, are these expenses connected to the financial transfers?" Whitaker stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor." He placed another document on the evidence table. "This is a receipt for a hotel suite at the Crawford Hotel in Denver." Harper scanned the page. 3 nights, she said. Whitaker nodded. "During the same week that Mr. Carrington transferred $12,000 into the undisclosed account." Connor felt Sloan lean closer. "Stay calm," Sloan whispered, but Connor's confidence had begun to erode. Judge Harper continued reading. "This pattern repeats several times," she said. Her tone remained neutral, but there was something unmistakable in it now. Interest. She turned another page. "Restaurant charges," she said. Then another. "Private reservations." Another. "Airline upgrades." Each document formed another connection. Connor felt the room shrinking slightly around him. Every transaction he had assumed was too small to matter had now been placed in chronological order. And when viewed together, they formed a pattern he could no longer deny. Judge Harper leaned back slightly in her chair. "Counselor Whitaker," she said. "Yes, Your Honor." "Are you suggesting these funds were intentionally concealed during the divorce filing?" Whitaker answered calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." Connor felt Sloan straighten beside him. "Your Honor," Sloan said quickly, "we object to any suggestion of intentional concealment without a full review of the financial context." Judge Harper raised a hand. "You will have an opportunity to review the documents." She paused. "But at this moment, the court is concerned with transparency." Harper looked again at Connor. "Mr. Carrington, financial disclosures during divorce proceedings are required to be complete." Connor nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper tapped the stack of papers again. "These records suggest a pattern of transfers and expenditures not included in your original filing." Connor's mouth felt dry. "We will need further explanation," Harper continued. Sloan stepped forward again. "Your Honor, we request time to review the supplemental documents." Harper considered this briefly. Then she nodded. "That request is reasonable." She turned one more page. "However," she added, "there appears to be additional material in this submission." Whitaker opened the folder again. "Yes, Your Honor." He removed a small flash drive and placed it on the evidence table. Connor felt something colder than anxiety move through him. Judge Harper looked at the drive. "And what does this contain?" Whitaker answered calmly. "An audio recording." Connor's heart skipped once. Sloan turned sharply toward him. "What recording?" he whispered. Connor did not answer, because suddenly he remembered something. A voicemail conversation months earlier. A careless one. And now that memory was sitting on the judge's desk. Judge Harper looked at Whitaker. "We will review that next." Connor Carrington realized too late that the evidence against him had only begun to unfold. The flash drive sat on the judge's desk like an object far heavier than its size suggested. Connor Carrington could not stop looking at it. Just a small piece of plastic and metal. Something that could easily disappear into a pocket or desk drawer. Something he would normally ignore without a second thought. But at that moment, the courtroom seemed to revolve around it. Judge Harper picked it up between her fingers and studied it briefly before looking toward David Whitaker. "This contains the audio recording you mentioned?" she asked. Whitaker nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Connor felt Richard Sloan shift beside him again. "What recording?" Sloan whispered quietly. Connor still did not answer, because he already knew, or at least he suspected. A memory had surfaced the moment the flash drive appeared. A late-night phone call several months earlier. Connor had been traveling at the time Boston, he thought. Or perhaps Denver. The hotel room had been quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic outside the window. Madeline had called him late. They had spoken casually, comfortably. And at some point, the conversation had turned toward money. Connor remembered saying something careless, something confident. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than a private conversation. Now it was sitting on the judge's desk. Judge Harper turned to the court clerk. "Please connect this to the courtroom system." The clerk nodded and stepped forward. Connor felt his pulse beginning to rise. Sloan leaned toward him again. "Connor," he whispered, his voice sharper now. "I need to know what's on that recording." Connor's voice came out lower than he expected. "I'm not sure." Sloan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not sure isn't good enough." Across the aisle, Isla Carrington remained seated beside Whitaker. Her posture had not changed since the hearing began. She did not look at Connor. She did not look at the flash drive. She simply waited. The clerk finished connecting the audio equipment and nodded toward the judge. "Ready, Your Honor." Judge Harper looked toward Whitaker. "Counselor, please explain the context of this recording." Whitaker stood. "Yes, Your Honor." He spoke calmly, his voice steady. This recording was recovered from an archived voicemail file associated with Mr. Carrington's personal email account. The voicemail had originally been left on his phone and automatically forwarded to his email system. Connor felt Sloan turn toward him again. "Did you know about this?" Sloan asked under his breath. Connor shook his head slightly. Whitaker continued. "The conversation occurred several months prior to the filing of the divorce petition. It involves Mr. Carrington discussing financial transfers with another individual." Judge Harper looked down at the file again. "And who is the other individual?" Whitaker answered clearly. "Madeline Pierce, Your Honor." Connor felt something shift inside his chest. Harper nodded. "Very well. Play the recording." The clerk pressed a key. For a brief moment, the courtroom was silent. Then the recording began. Connor recognized his own voice immediately. It sounded relaxed, almost amused. "We'll just move the funds before everything's finalized." The words echoed through the courtroom speakers. Connor felt the air leave his lungs slowly. The recording continued. "Once the divorce is done, it won't matter where the money was originally." A second voice followed. "Madeline," her tone light, almost playful. "Smart," a soft laugh. Connor's voice again. "I've already moved most of it into the investment account. The rest will go next month." The audio ended. Silence returned to the courtroom. But it was no longer the same kind of silence. Judge Harper did not speak immediately. She looked down at the transcript Whitaker had placed on the bench. Then she read the lines again, carefully. Connor felt Sloan slowly straighten beside him. The attorney's earlier calm had disappeared. Instead, there was something sharper in his posture now. Concern. Finally, Judge Harper looked up. "Mr. Carrington," she said. Connor forced himself to meet her gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper tapped the transcript lightly. "Is that your voice in the recording?" Connor hesitated. Sloan spoke quickly. "Your Honor, we request time to review the authenticity and context of." Harper raised her hand. That question was directed to Mr. Carrington. Connor swallowed. "Yes," he said. The answer landed heavily in the quiet room. Harper nodded slowly. "And the individual speaking with you is Miss Madeline Pierce." Connor's voice felt tight. "Yes." Harper leaned back slightly. The room remained completely silent. She studied the transcript once more. "Mr. Carrington," she said calmly, "this recording suggests that you knowingly transferred marital funds prior to the divorce with the intention of concealing them." Sloan stepped forward again. "Your Honor, my client did not intend to conceal." Harper raised her hand again. "I have not yet reached a conclusion, Counselor." She turned her attention back to the documents Whitaker had provided. "The financial transfers we reviewed earlier appear to correspond directly with the statements made in this recording." Whitaker nodded. "That is correct, Your Honor." Connor felt the weight of the evidence settling around him, piece by piece. Bank transfers, hotel receipts, emails, and now his own voice explaining the entire plan. Judge Harper closed the transcript. Financial disclosure is a fundamental requirement in divorce proceedings, she said. Her voice remained steady. When one party intentionally conceals assets, the court must address that behavior seriously. Connor felt Sloan lean closer. "We can still respond," Sloan whispered. But Connor understood something in that moment. The hearing had already moved beyond the simple divorce he expected. This was no longer just a dispute over property. It was becoming a question of credibility. And credibility, once damaged in a courtroom, rarely returns intact. Judge Harper looked again toward Whitaker. "Counselor, is there additional evidence connected to this timeline?" Whitaker answered calmly. "Yes, Your Honor. However, we believe the current materials are sufficient for the court's preliminary review." Harper nodded slowly. She looked once more at Connor. "Mr. Carrington, the court will need further explanation regarding these financial activities." Connor said nothing. Because suddenly the careful plan he had built over months, the quiet transfers, the hidden account, the private conversations had been reconstructed in front of him with uncomfortable precision. And the person who had done it had not spoken a single word in the courtroom. Isla Carrington still sat quietly beside her attorney, watching, waiting. The evidence was speaking for her. The courtroom remained still after the audio recording ended. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of recognition. Judge Evelyn Harper sat behind the bench, her fingers resting lightly on the transcript of the recording. The documents in front of her, bank statements, travel receipts, and the printed timeline David Whitaker had assembled formed a quiet but unmistakable structure. Each piece connected to the next. Connor Carrington felt the structure closing around him. Richard Sloan shifted beside him, opening his legal pad and writing quickly, his pen pressing harder than usual into the paper. Across the aisle, Isla Carrington remained motionless. Her calm had not changed since the moment the hearing began. Judge Harper finally spoke again. "Mr. Carrington," she said. Connor straightened slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper's voice remained measured. Divorce proceedings rely on one essential principle: complete financial transparency. Connor nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper gestured toward the documents. "These records suggest that a significant portion of marital assets was transferred into an undisclosed account over several months." She paused. "Those transfers were not included in your financial disclosure." Connor opened his mouth slightly. Sloan stood immediately. "Your Honor, we request the opportunity to review the context of those transfers before any conclusions are drawn." Harper regarded him calmly. "You will have that opportunity." She lifted the transcript of the recording again. But the audio recording indicates the transfers were made intentionally prior to the divorce filing. Connor felt the tension building in the room. Sloan stepped closer to the bench. "Your Honor, the statement in that recording could be interpreted in several ways. My client may have been referring to routine financial planning." Harper raised an eyebrow slightly. "Routine financial planning does not normally involve omitting accounts from required disclosures." Sloan remained silent for a moment. The judge turned her attention back to the documents. "Mr. Carrington," she said, "the court is particularly concerned with the timeline of these transactions." Connor felt his throat tighten. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper tapped one page. "The transfers began approximately 8 months ago." She tapped another. "They continued after the divorce paperwork was prepared." Another. "And they correspond with travel expenses listed here." Connor knew exactly which expenses she meant. The hotels, the flights, the dinners, the trips he had believed no one was tracking. Harper looked toward Whitaker. "Counselor Whitaker, have these records been verified?" Whitaker stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The financial institutions have confirmed the transfers, and the travel receipts were obtained directly from the issuing companies." Harper nodded. Connor felt Sloan lean toward him again. "Stay quiet," Sloan whispered. Harper folded her hands. The court must now determine whether Mr. Carrington's financial disclosure was incomplete due to oversight or intentional concealment. The phrase hung in the air. Intentional concealment. Connor felt the weight of those words settle heavily in the room. Sloane stepped forward once more. Your Honor, we respectfully request time to review the supplemental materials and prepare a response. Harper considered this briefly. That request is reasonable. She turned to the clerk. However, the court will also issue an immediate order requiring a full financial review of all accounts associated with Mr. Carrington. Connor felt Sloane stiffen beside him. Harper continued. All investment accounts transfers and corporate expense reimbursements connected to the transactions presented today will be subject to examination. Connor's pulse quickened. Corporate expenses. That meant Redwood. Sloane cleared his throat carefully. Your Honor, are you suggesting a forensic audit? Harper met his eyes. Yes. The word landed quietly, but its implications were enormous. A forensic financial review would examine everything. Every transfer, every reimbursement, every expense report Connor had submitted through Redwood Urban Development. Connor realized something then. The investigation would not stop with the divorce. If Redwood's corporate expenses had been used improperly during his trips with Madeline, the company would see those records too. Judge Harper continued speaking. Until that review is completed, the court will freeze the undisclosed investment account. Connor inhaled sharply. Sloane turned toward him quickly. Connor, he whispered. How much is currently in that account? Connor answered quietly. About $400,000. Sloane closed his eyes briefly. At the bench, Harper continued. The court will also reconsider the division of marital assets once the full financial picture has been established. Whitaker nodded slightly. Connor heard Sloane exhale slowly beside him. Across the aisle, Isla had still not spoken. Not once. And yet the courtroom had shifted entirely in her direction. Judge Harper turned one final time toward Connor. Mr. Carrington, she said. Yes, Your Honor. Financial transparency is not optional during divorce proceedings. Connor nodded stiffly. I understand. Harper studied him for a moment. Do you? Connor did not answer immediately. The truth was that he understood now in a way he had not understood before. He had believed the divorce would be quick, clean, quiet. Instead, the courtroom had become something else entirely. A place where every financial decision he had made over the past year was now visible. Judge Harper closed the case file. This hearing is adjourned pending further financial review. The clerk spoke next. All rise. Everyone in the room stood as the judge exited. Connor remained still for a moment before gathering his papers. Sloane leaned toward him again, his voice lower now. We need to talk immediately. Connor nodded. Across the aisle, Whitaker quietly closed his folder. Isla stood beside him. For the first time that morning, Connor looked directly at her. Isla met his gaze calmly. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, just quiet distance. Connor realized something uncomfortable in that moment. Everything that had happened in the courtroom, the documents, the timeline, the recording, had not been created by lawyers. They had been collected by Isla, patiently, silently, for months. And now the court had seen what she had seen all along. Connor looked away first, because the confidence he had carried into the courtroom that morning was gone. The hallway outside courtroom 6B filled slowly as people began leaving their hearings. Some couples walked past each other without speaking. Others argued quietly with their attorneys. A few sat on the wooden benches, staring down at their phones, absorbing decisions that had just altered their lives. Connor Carrington stepped out of the courtroom beside Richard Sloane, the leather folder still clutched tightly in his hand. The confidence he had carried into the building that morning had disappeared somewhere between the bank records and the audio recording. Now his movements felt heavier, slower. Sloane stopped near the elevator doors and turned toward him. Connor, he said quietly. Connor looked up. We need to go over everything immediately. Connor nodded. Yes. Sloan adjusted his glasses and lowered his voice. That forensic audit the judge ordered is serious. Very serious. Connor swallowed. I understand. Sloan shook his head slightly. I don't think you fully do yet. Connor said nothing. Sloan continued. If those corporate expense reports connect to personal travel, Redwood's legal department could become involved. Connor felt the weight of that possibility settle into his chest. Redwood Urban Development was not the kind of company that tolerated financial irregularities from senior executives, especially not executives responsible for major investment projects. Sloan continued. And the undisclosed investment account, $400,000, is now frozen. Connor nodded again. That money can't be moved or accessed until the court reviews it. Sloan studied him carefully. Connor, I need absolute honesty from you now. Connor looked at the floor. Have you moved any other funds we haven't discussed? Connor hesitated. Then he shook his head. No. Sloan held his gaze for several seconds. Good. He exhaled slowly, because at this point, any additional undisclosed accounts would make things significantly worse. Connor leaned against the wall. What happens next? Sloan answered carefully. The court-appointed financial examiner will begin reviewing every account connected to you. Connor already knew what that meant. Bank transfers, corporate reimbursements, travel expenses, everything. Sloan closed his notebook. We'll talk later today, he said. For now, go home, stay quiet, and do not move any money. Connor nodded again. Sloan walked toward the elevator, leaving Connor standing alone in the hallway. For several seconds, Connor didn't move. Then he noticed someone approaching from the opposite direction. Isla. She was walking beside David Whitaker, speaking quietly with him as they moved through the corridor. Whitaker nodded once and shook her hand before turning toward the elevators. Isla continued walking toward the exit. Connor remained where he was. When she reached him, she stopped. For the first time since the hearing began, they stood face to face without a judge or attorneys between them. The hallway noise seemed to fade around them. Connor searched her expression. You knew, he said quietly. Isla didn't respond immediately. Connor tried again. You knew about the account. Isla nodded once. Yes. Connor felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. How long? Isla answered calmly. Long enough? Connor ran a hand through his hair. You could have just asked me. Isla looked at him steadily. Would you have told me the truth? Connor didn't answer, because the silence between them already contained the answer. Isla continued. I didn't want an argument. Connor looked up. Then what did you want? Isla considered the question for a moment. The truth, she said simply. Connor exhaled slowly. You got it. Isla shook her head slightly. No. Connor frowned. What do you mean? Isla looked toward the courthouse entrance, where winter light filtered through the glass doors. The court got it. Connor felt the quiet weight of that sentence. Everything he had tried to hide had now become part of an official record. Bank transfers, emails, the recording. Connor studied Isla again. You planned this. Isla met his gaze calmly. I documented it. Connor gave a short, humorless laugh. That sounds like the same thing. Isla didn't argue. Connor hesitated before speaking again. Madeline didn't know you were collecting all this. Isla's voice remained steady. She didn't need to. Connor nodded slowly. For the first time in years, he seemed unsure of what to say next. Finally, he asked something quieter. Are you satisfied now? Isla looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head. This was never about satisfaction. Connor frowned slightly. Then what was it about? Isla answered without hesitation. Accountability. Connor looked away. Outside the courthouse windows, snow had begun falling lightly over the city. People moved past the building on the sidewalk, their lives continuing in ordinary rhythms. Inside the hallway, the end of a marriage stood quietly between two people who once believed they understood each other. Isla adjusted the strap of her coat over her shoulder. I have to go, she said. Connor nodded. Isla. She paused. Connor struggled for a moment before finding the words. I didn't expect any of this. Isla looked at him calmly. That's because you never expected anyone to look. Connor didn't argue. He couldn't, because she was right. Isla walked toward the courthouse doors without looking back. Connor remained standing in the hallway for several seconds after she left. Then he turned slowly and walked toward the opposite exit. Outside, the cold Chicago wind moved between the tall buildings, carrying the quiet sound of traffic and distant footsteps. For Connor Carrington, the day had not ended with the divorce he expected. It had ended with something else entirely. Consequences. And for Isla Carrington, the courtroom had never been a place for revenge. It had simply been the place where the truth finally spoke out loud. In life, justice rarely arrives with loud announcements. More often it appears the way it did for Isla Carrington, slowly, patiently built from small details that others overlook. For months, Isla had said very little. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She didn't try to expose Connor in public. Instead, she observed. She documented. And when the moment came, she allowed the truth to speak for itself. That quiet strength is something we rarely see celebrated in dramatic stories. We often expect justice to look like anger or revenge. But sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like preparation. And sometimes it looks like a woman walking out of a courthouse with her dignity intact without needing to say another word. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel around the world. And if you appreciate stories about quiet resilience, accountability, and the long road to justice, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories ahead. Stories where the truth takes its time, but always finds its way into the light.